Today, we'll see about one of Ethiopian leader, which is the story of Mengistu Hayle Mariam and the Derg regime, a period of revolution, dictatorship, and significant turmoil that shaped Ethiopia's modern history. Before Mengistu came to power, Ethiopia was ruled by Emperor Hayle Selassie I, a significant figure known worldwide for his long reign, 1930 to 1974, and modernization efforts. Despite his achievements, Ethiopia faced, while Haile Selassie promoted infrastructure and education, much of the rural population remained poor and feudal land ownership was common. In the early 1970s, a severe famine struck northern Ethiopia, particularly Wollo, leading to mass starvation. The government's failure to respond effectively angered many citizens. Students, workers, and military officials began demanding reforms. Revolutionary ideas from Marxism and socialism spread among young intellectuals and soldiers. By 1974, public frustration turned into widespread protests. The Ethiopian military, tired of the old feudal system, decided to intervene. A group of soldiers formed the Dergau U 2013, a short name for Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police, and Territorial Army. The Derg, made up of junior military officers, aimed to overthrow Emperor Haile Selassie and bring reforms. On September 12, 1974, Haile Selassie was deposed. This ended centuries of monarchy and marked the beginning of a new era. Mengistu Hayle Mariam, a little-known officer at the time, quickly rose through the ranks within the Derg because of his strong personality, charisma, and ruthless tactics. Although the Derg was initially a collective group, divisions and infighting broke out. Mengistu Hayle Mariam eliminated rivals and consolidated power. Early on, Mengistu faced opposition from more moderate members of the Derg and other political factions. To secure his rule, Mengistu launched a brutal campaign known as the Red Terror against political opponents, particularly targeting students and leftist groups like the EPRP, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Victims were often left in the streets as a warning. This earned Mengistu a reputation as one of the most feared leaders in Africa. By 1977, Mengistu officially declared himself head of state and leader of the Derg. He pursued a socialist agenda, modeling Ethiopia after countries like the Soviet Union and Cuba. Mengistu abolished the old feudal system and redistributed land to peasants. This move was initially popular but poorly managed, leading to inefficiency and food shortages. Private businesses, banks, and industries were taken over by the state. However, corruption and mismanagement crippled economic growth. Mengistu emphasized literacy campaigns and expanding the military to defend the regime against internal and external enemies. Mengistu's Ethiopia became heavily dependent on aid from the Soviet Union, which proved under Mengistu's leadership, Eritrea, a northern region annexed by Ethiopia, waged a long and bloody war for independence. Mengistu's government responded with brutal military campaigns, but the Eritrean rebels continued to gain ground. Several ethnic and rebel groups across Ethiopia, including the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, opposed Mengistu's regime. By the 1980s, these groups formed alliances, increasing pressure on the Derg. One of the worst famines in modern history devastated northern Ethiopia, causing nearly 1 million deaths. Mengistu's government was criticized for ignoring the crisis and prioritizing military spending over humanitarian needs. International attention grew, and Ethiopia became the focus of massive relief efforts, like Live Aid concerts organized by musicians such as Bob Geldof. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Mengistu lost his biggest ally and financial supporter. Ethiopian rebel groups, led by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, advanced towards the capital. Years of war, famine, and mismanagement had left the Ethiopian economy in ruins. In May 1991, as rebels closed in on Addis Ababa, Mengistu fled Ethiopia. He sought asylum in Zimbabwe, where he lives to this day under the protection of Robert Mugabe's former government. For some, he is seen as a dictator responsible for the deaths of thousands during the Red Terror and various wars. Others view his land reforms as a step towards equality, breaking centuries of feudal oppression. In 2006, Mengistu was tried in absentia by Ethiopia's courts and found guilty of genocide for his role in the Red Terror. He was sentenced to death, but Zimbabwe refused to extradite him. The story of Mengistu Hayle Mariam and the Derg is a cautionary tale about revolution, power, and its consequences. While Mengistu promised equality and socialism, his regime left a legacy of violence, economic hardship, and division.
By the late 1980s, Mengistu's Derg regime faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts. Years of war, corruption, and mismanagement left Ethiopia's economy in ruins. Land collectivization and nationalization under Mengistu failed, causing food shortages and worsening poverty. Ethiopia remained dependent on foreign aid, especially during the 1983-1985 famine, which claimed the lives of nearly 1 million people. The Eritrean War of Independence. Syrian rebels. EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front, fought for independence from Ethiopia. The Derg's military campaigns were brutal but unsuccessful. As the rebels gained territory and international support, ethnic-based rebel groups rose against Mengistu's rule, the most prominent being the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front (TPLF) and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front (EPRDF), a coalition of rebel groups. The TPLF, led by Meles Zenawi, played a crucial role in the military resistance against Mengistu. Mengistu's regime relied heavily on military and economic support from the Soviet Union. By 1990, the Soviet Union began to collapse, and its aid to Ethiopia stopped, leaving Mengistu without critical weapons and resources. In early 1991, Mengistu launched desperate military campaigns to hold rebel forces back, but his army was demoralized and poorly equipped. By May 1991, the EPRDF, EPLF, and other rebel groups had surrounded Addis Ababa. On May 21, 1991, Mengistu boarded a flight to Zimbabwe, where he was granted asylum by then-President Robert Mugabe. The Derg officially fell, marking the end of Mengistu's rule and the 17-year military regime. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front (EPRDF), led by Meles Zenawi, seized control of Addis Ababa on May 28, 1991. Meles Zenawi, a former guerrilla fighter and leader of the TPLF, emerged as the key political leader. Meles Zenawi chaired the Transitional Government of Ethiopia (TGE), which was tasked with rebuilding the country after years of war and dictatorship. Ethiopia was divided into regional states based on ethnic groups. Each region had a degree of autonomy. Peace with Eritrea. In 1993, Eritrea gained independence through a referendum, ending decades of conflict. Reform and rebuilding. Meles emphasized economic development and rebuilding Ethiopia's shattered